Thank you. So now we're going to start our session on the patriarchy and war. So our first speaker is Kozue Akibayashi. She is the international president of the the international president of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She is a feminist researcher and an activist who has worked on issues of gender and peace, as well as protested U.S. and Japanese militarism in Okinawa. And invite you up to the podium to speak.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you very much for the organizer to invite me to this conference. I came from. Is this better? Okay. Is this better?
Okay. You can also come to the podium if the mic is better.
If this is okay, I'm fine here. Thank you. But again, thank you very much for the invitation to this conference. I thank you the organizers. I thank U.S. section of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and I thank you, of course, the American University. I've been here many times as my capacity of a professor at the Ritsumeikan University, which the position I no longer hold. I moved to another university, but I came here often with the students. So it's very nice to be here, and of course in the Washington D.C. to introduce what has been going on in a very far away location from here in Northeast Asia. Our organization, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, last year celebrated our 100th anniversary, so we are 101 years old. Thank you very much. It's good that we survived the 100 years, but it also means that because we started in 1915 to stop the war that had begun a year earlier in 1914. So women gathered from different parts of the world to stop the war. We have not been able to. So I don't know if the celebration of our 100th anniversary is a very happy one, or it's an evidence for us that challenges are still ahead of us. Women from different parts of the world gathered in 1915 at The Hague because we wanted to make sure that more people know that war is, there are root causes of war, that namely, to put it very, very simply, patriarchy. The exclusion of women from decision-making process because we did not have voting right at the time was one of the main causes of war, we argued. And patriarchy, I think Barbara will be discussing more fully theoretically. To put it very simply, it's male domination. Not only male in biological sense, but it's very much about the value system, that the masculine, I would say, values that are almost connected to their biologically connected to male, but not necessarily by male. Masculine values, I would say, it's a value system that put high priority in power and force and strength. To be strong is better than to be weak. And we all know that we have vulnerability in our life at different stages of our life, but that cannot be recognized as a part of our life. That has to be something that has to be overcome by force or strength. And that's one of the root causes of the problematic social system of patriarchy as well the war system that I think the previous panel addressed. I would like to introduce some of the grassroots work of women in the region in the Asia Pacific. I have been working with a women's group called Okinawa Women's Act Against Military Violence for the past 20 years. I am not Okinawan, if you're familiar with the geography. Okinawa is a part of Japan. I'm sure peace move, and I would, if you don't, I strongly urge you to learn about the geography in our region, because the U.S. military has been there for the past 71 years, since 1945, when Japan was defeated in the Asia Pacific War. The war, Japan started in 1931, and the U.S. participated in the later stage of the war. And there was, well, you're aware of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, of course, but the direct combat between Japan and the United States was waged in the very small place called Okinawa. It's a very, very small island that only have 1% of the entire Japanese land area, where almost 75% of the U.S. military facilities exclusively used by the U.S. military is located. The population is very small, of course, 1.3 thereabout. That's another 1% of the entire population of Japan. The U.S. military, altogether, troops and dependents and family members, civilian workers, 50,000 of them have lived on this island. There are many, many impacts, negative impacts, because of the presence of the U.S. military. Environmental destruction is, of course, one of them. Accidents, crimes are committed, and crimes are committed by U.S. soldiers with something called the SOFA status of Forces Agreement. I'm sure you're aware. That's a bilateral agreement that the United States conclude with host nations to stipulate the legal status of troops and dependents and family members stationed on the base. They do not have to go through regular immigration process, so the Japanese government nor the local authority know who's there, who's on the base, if you have the SOFA status. And when they commit a crime, even outside the base, if the U.S. military argue that it's on duty, and the first jurisdiction goes to U.S. military, not the local authority. So even even traffic accidents or even drunk driving, many cases they got away because it's the U.S. military who investigate and apprehend in some cases. That shows not only what that shows colonial attitude, racist attitudes towards people in the host communities in the Asia Pacific area. Similar agreements were concluded between Korea, United States and Korea, or the United States and the Philippines. So that's another aspect of the negative impacts of the U.S. military presence in our region. Most notably, we have been working on this issue of sexual violence by U.S. soldiers. You hear from time to time hideous cases of sexual assaults by U.S. soldiers. Since 1945, when the U.S. military landed on Okinawa, not a single year passed by without sexual assaults by U.S. soldiers for 71 years. We recently have another case in May, but that's not the only one. We started to I keep saying we because I have been working with this Okinawan women's group for 20 years, and I did my master's thesis on them. I wrote my dissertation on them, so I have and it's very common in academics to move on when you finish with the dissertation. Well, the problem is still there, and I think I owe them for this position that I am now. And of course, I am very, very committed to end this problem in Okinawa. So I'm still with them. So that is why I keep referring to this, keep saying that we. So Okinawa Women Act Against Military Violence started to compile a chronology of sexual violence, sexual crimes committed by U.S. soldiers in Okinawa since 1945. The number, we hesitated to say this number, hundreds, of course, but we know that this is not even a tip of the larger iceberg, because the nature of sexual crimes. It's more difficult for victims of sexual crimes to report the case, and because victims are often blamed in these cases. The cases you hear in the major media is, I would say, when the victim fits in this patriarchal value victim model. When the victim is younger, when the victim was assaulted on the street, for example, that fits very much in the victim image in a patriarchal society. When women in prostitution were assaulted, that happened many, many times, particularly in the Vietnam War period, when U.S. military used bases in Okinawa to be deployed before they go to Vietnam. So the bases in Okinawa, some of them were finishing place for soldiers to be deployed in Okinawa, because the climate is closer, is similar between Okinawa and Vietnam, and the United States couldn't have any other bases that can cater to that need. So for example, in 1960s and 70s, and that's when Okinawa was recovering from the devastating battle that took place in 1945. They were rebuilding their infrastructure, and they experienced many cases of sexual violence in earlier time, when anyone could be assaulted at any place, at home, at field hospitals, at workplace, and field when they go pick up vegetables and so forth. So that was their experience in 1945 to early 1950 thereabout. When they started to rebuild their society, they realized that they had to do something with this sexual assault that's been happening at any place. So there goes prostitution around the bases. The prostitution is an institutional part of the military, as you may know. That still exists in Okinawa. That still exists in Korea, around the bases in Korea, and I'm a little bit off the topic, but there's a lawsuit brought by women in camp town in Korea who worked in prostitution 1960s and 70s, Korean women who do not have any social security or whatsoever. After many years of that was their work, but they got older, and the U.S. military bases in Korea are now going through, transformation. They moved to different locations. These women got older in their 60s and 70s. They do not have any means of the support of their life, and most of all, they face very strong discrimination within Korean society because of their profession. They're now suing the Korean government to start with, because that was a clear part of the bilateral negotiation between the United States and Korea, when the United States started to say in late 1960s that they want to withdraw from South Korea. And one of the major methods that the Korean government under Park Chung-hee was to offer cleaner camptown prostitution. So they offered more meticulous STD examination so that the soldiers can enjoy, quote unquote, cleaner women and safer women. So that was between Korea and the United States. And document has been found, research has been done. It's a clear part of the U.S.-Korea military alliance. They are suing the Korean government again first for a compensation, very small amount. What they want to have is to get rid of this stigma that imposed on them in a Korean society. We, Okinawan women and women in the host communities of other countries, including Korea, the Philippines. We have friends in colleagues in Guam, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, U.S. territories where U.S. militaries have been, and mainland the United States and mainland Japan. We had worked together to first analyze the militarized security system by looking at the history of sexual violence committed by the U.S. military in the host communities. It's a manifestation, we argue, of that masculine values that sits in the very, very core of the military, the institution of the military. We argue that in order for a young man mainly to be able to kill the enemy, actually kill the enemy and destroy other communities, we argue that they have to go through a different set of values, and that is a training of the military to dehumanize the others, dehumanize the enemy, and racism, of course, is a more explicit part of that training. During the Asia-Pacific War, the Japanese were, the yellow monkeys, the lesser being. During the Vietnam War, similar racism was explicitly taught in the military training. Current times, Islamophobia is the very, very core of the military training and values. But what underlies throughout is misogyny, the denial of something like feminine values, that is caring, that is to admit that everyone has a weak part, and everyone is vulnerable. Everyone can be vulnerable. That, I think, is a feminine values that is completely denied in the military, because you can't have that thinking when you need a professional soldier to kill. And sexual violence within the military including, and sexual violence assaults in the host community, we argue that it's a manifestation of that values that are taught explicitly and implicitly in the military. Okay. And we also so that is the basis of our criticism of the militarized security system. Okay, I have 2 minutes. And we came up with our alternative of a security concept and policy and probably discourse. We have been arguing for this for the probably past 15 years or so. The first, our concern was about human security. When human security discourse was introduced in mid-1990s, we welcomed that. But we also saw over the few years afterwards that it was also being taken over by so-called middle power to start with, but more powerful ones as well. So, based on our feminine values, we put forward our idea of humane security, and we urge everyone to ask. It's very, very basic 4 questions in terms of when we look at the any security policies. One is about environment. Is the security policy that is proposed or discussed, would it protect all lives, the environment, to be more sustainable? we are thinking about generation, intergeneration. We're not looking at only this generation, but the children and the grandchildren's generation. So that is one, environmental-wise. Two, in any order, in fact, are these security policies assured for basic needs? The security should be about us living in security. And those are not abstract terms. Those have concrete conditions. So basic needs, do we have basic needs? Do we have enough clothes? Do we have enough food? Do we have adequate shelter? Do we have, particularly probably in the United States, do we have adequate access to healthcare or the medical system? Or do we have access to education? Those basic needs are assured in the security policies. So that's the second one. In our experience of, again, living in host communities in Asia-Pacific area, we also questioned about identity. Our identity, whether our identity and identity, cultural or individual, that includes sexual orientation, are these respected? Because many cases, the building of military bases, and I wish I could show some pictures of that the proposed military building site. Many of them are built in in our culture, like worship area, because those are wide space from the eyes of the U.S. military strategy-wise. It's just an open space. No, it has a very important cultural and at times religious meaning. That is why it's open space. It's not vacant or anything. There's an importance in that. But from a military strategy perspective, it's just an open space. Well, we can bomb. We conduct live ammunition drills. That is not only destructive to environment, but that is very deep respect to other cultures. And that we have seen in many, many cases in those host communities. And that's one of the examples of disrespectful attitudes or thinking in the security policies. The last one, fourth one, is whether we are protected from avoidable harm. We often talk about protection, being protected. We need to be protected. In our case, particularly recently, Japan have to be protected from DPRK because they have DPR, North Korea. They have missile, quote unquote, launch, and they're developing nuclear weapons and so forth. So then we often talk about the protection, but why don't we look at the harms? Are we protected from avoidable harm? We need to. Another example maybe you probably know. 4 or 5 years. When was that? 2011. Japan was hit. The part of Japan was hit by earthquake. That caused heavy damage, to say the least, to that region and other parts of Japan. Well, earthquake cannot be really avoidable. That happens, but what happened afterwards in that region is the nuclear crisis, nuclear power plant crisis. That could have been avoided, and that should have been avoided. So when we talk about protection, we need to look at the harms, what kind of harms we are talking about, what can be avoided, and what should be avoided, and how. That should be at the core of our security policy, discourse, and concepts. So that's what we came up. This is something that women's grassroots work devised from our analysis, that again came from their experiences of living a fence away from this very aggressive force of the U.S. military in the region in what is technically a peacetime. So I hope that can be a part of the strategy within the United States about the ground, whatever that is, to cope with the military strategy in this country, because that affects even us that is far away from where we are. So thank you very much.